Hi guys, good evening. Hope you're fine. Everything is good. So this week episode, we are having a smart club on Kosovo politics. And for Cross Atlantic Crosstalk, our friend Jamaa Bickley is back. So we are very excited about that. So many
Look, I
news.
hate to interrupt or whatever. I'm sure whatever's happening is important. Of course it is. But what's happening is the studio is almost together, and we got to pick out the curtains, we got to pick out the drapes, and we got to get the pipe and drape going. Those are all the same thing. I said with different words. So we have either black, very somber. Maybe there's an ordinary person who's had a hard time. Things are hard. We have politician kind of optimistic blue, twirling into the future, abortions for some, this kind of thing. What do we got to do?
Blue's fine, but you're going to need some pans.
Okay, I'll take it.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Berlin, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, August the 2nd, Mario Quade, Jamaa Bickley King, Orgesa Arifi, Arber Zaimi, our Continental Royal and Papal Correspondent Hawely Brett, and featuring Deputy Director of Committee, our own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now a man who is generally pleased with himself, but especially so now, Arun Chaudhary.
Thank you so much. I am pleased with myself. Like raising a barn, I have raised a studio using only cloth and tent poles and C-stands. And really, I'm just getting started, so if this looks a little cruddy.
And an amazing pair of pants. That's just...
Yeah, look, I heard you on the pants thing. Okay? So, that's going to have to be a next time thing, because as you know, we had our meeting so close to the show today that there really isn't a time to take the notes and do anything with them, which almost makes me wonder, why notes? Again, I'm questioning notes. But I did take your note about the blue versus the black. I think that's good. I think that's a good note. I think we can work with that. What did you think about the entrance? Did you find it compelling when I came through the curtain? I hadn't really anticipated that being a move.
But that was very Carson-esque. That was really good.
Are you saying it's derivative, or are you saying it's an homage?
Well, it could be an homage, yeah. If we put some music.
Should be an homage. Yeah. Could be no. Should be an homage. So let's write that down. And then the other thing that I wanted to do with our 60 segment slot here was, look, tonight we're actually doing Smart Club on Kosovo politics, and actually just about everyone on the panel is someone who committee works with in Kosovo. And so actually wanted to do in 60 seconds a really brief overview because it's gotten complicated, people knowing where we work, where we don't work, all of the places that committee is working. I think I can probably do it in 60 seconds. So let's put it on the board.
And now here's 60 seconds on the board.
Okay, are you saying this is all derivative? Are you saying this? You know that I'm channeling Jack Benny and not Johnny Carson.
I was not supposed. I just felt the need to do that. I'm sorry. Okay.
All right.
60 seconds on the board.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, vai.
Okay, so what is committee? Committee is a strategic communications agency, as you hear every time we talk about it. What does that mean? In case of us, it mostly means that we're taking message and turning that into narrative and framing, and then suggesting creative products that can be made for it, whether with a party or a candidate's team they already have, or assembling a team to help them make it on the outside. Committee has worked in the UK, has worked in the US, especially in 2020 and 2019 in the UK. But other than that, we are currently working, just, so we have us all transparent. We're working in Holland, Kosovo, Italy, Sweden, and France. And that's it. Now, The reason I think it's worth mentioning is because you'll notice these places sort of come up over and over again on the show, and it's not necessarily because they are the most important places, although committee specifically, our mission is to try to counter-program the right as they do sort of chomp through Europe, and so these are very strategic places. But you'll notice on the show, we're doing these things because we've already done a lot of research, already know a lot of people, already know a lot about what's happening, and so it's much easier for us to bring that information to you. How many seconds was that?
A bit more than 60, but it was interesting.
But so I need to refine this for like the elevator pitch if I'm going to try to, do it in elevators, for instance.
We can put some elevator music for next time as a background.
Okay, we'll try this again next time, and next time we'll do that. On with the show. Hi, and welcome to the committee program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary, and this is our segment, Cross-Atlantic Cross Talk. With us, as always, is the show's own Julia Doubleday, and today we are joined by friend of the show, Jamaa Bickley King, coming to us all the way from one of the Carolinas, I forget which, I think the North, and Mario Quade, who is outside Hanover in Germany, and who you will recognize from the chat of the show and one of our fearless moderators, who keeps evil at bay on a fairly semi-regular basis. And thank you for joining us for the first time. Okay. So I did want to start in Virginia, and you could probably shut this down pretty quick because but as we've said on the show before, Virginia is a bellwether, one of the off-year elections that happens before we see the midterms and then before the presidential. It lets us know a lot about how things are moving. And we see tighter polls than one would think with establishment Democratic candidate Terry McAuliffe and his opponent. Can you just tell us the state of the race and talk us down? Is this something we should actually be paying attention to? Is this close?
Yes, you should. There's this interesting thing, and I think I discussed it a little bit more on the last time we had me on, is that people consider Virginia beady blue, and that's absolutely not the case. It is very much purple. We are very much always fighting and dying for like one vote at a time, and we're trying to go ahead and continue that streak, which is really difficult because we have a couple of things that are headwind. Number one, the funding community believes Terry has it in the bag, which is absolutely not true. There was some polling that I saw recently, I can't remember who, but he was actually lagging behind like first term Democratic delegates in their district, which is pretty crazy. And then on top of that, he's not over 50%. He's not over 50% in any of the polls. Youngkin is not that far behind in the polls. And Virginia historically has a lot of Democratic lean in the off-year elections. And like if he's up by like 2, you may actually be down by 2 or 4 or more. And that is something that we historically look at as we kind of do this stuff on a regular basis. So you should be very much concerned about not only the top of ticket, but all the way down. But the more concerning thing for us, the people that do work in that state, is how the supporting infrastructure is responding to that. Some of them believe that it's going to be fine, and we're telling them that's not the case. There is issues with the resourcing of that, and some of that is not even an unwillingness, is that everybody rightly flew their budgets apart trying to get rid of the Orange Menace last year, which is what you absolutely should do. You do whatever you can to get that man out of office. They did that, and now they're licking
it was a
their
closer
wounds
election than anyone would have predicted.
Exactly, and so they did everything that they were supposed to do last year, and now we're in a situation where, Virginia has these elections, but if the census had done what it did, we would have already had our state legislature redrawn, our congressional districts redrawn under a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, and now that seems to be in jeopardy because the orange shit demon screwed up the census. And so now we're going to this election will be the governor who will be over that will actually be the one that's actually going to have to do the districts there. And Terry has a shot to lose, and it's a real chance with a guy who's going to self-fund, who going to have unlimited Carlyle Group money. And it's going to be difficult to craft a narrative where, there's so much difference between Youngkin and Terry, where Youngkin is more of a traditional, I just want to make a lot of money Republican who has the discipline to hide all the racism until they get in the office. And so that's kind of what's really troubling for us and the resourcing piece. Now, we do believe we'll close those resourcing gaps. We just don't know when and how long it will take. And we're hoping it doesn't compromise engagement and program. So, time will tell. But this is definitely something people should be looking at. In addition to, this is also like the political petri dish where they're trying to push out critical race theory as a way to mobilize their kind of dormant and apathetic Republican base that has been flirting with voting Democrat for a while because they're not into that racism, which is ironic by actually pushing something that promotes racism, because it's a pretty good bet. Because if you can't get critical race theory to mobilize people in Virginia, it's not going to mobilize anywhere. They're literally trying to protect their grandparents.
I have a question.
And yeah.
We've spoken about this even before, not on the show, so not helpful to folks. But there are these festering scandals in the Democratic leadership of Virginia, in Northam and the Lieutenant Governor Fairfax, right? His, one
Fairfax,
of whom has incredibly, major sexual assault allegations, and the other one couldn't remember if he was the Klan guy or the guy in blackface in a photo. Have these chickens come home to roost a bit, and that it's hard to start speaking about the bigotry of Republicans when literally nothing was done about sort of two incredibly bigoted things that happened inside the Democratic Party? Or is this all independent of that, and that was a storm that was successfully weathered?
I think it's somewhere between both of those statements. I don't think it's so much it was successfully weathered. It was that it was dealt with in-house. It was like Justin Fairfax tried to run for governor for reasons we don't understand, and he was like, I think, an also ran toward him. So he's basically been dealt with through the process. Northam has been doing whatever he can do to make sure that episode is not the first paragraph of his Wikipedia page. So he has basically done anything African American centric or that is facing the community or the community has wanted, so much so that when they were going to slow roll the marijuana legalization, which the African American community was like, okay, that's not as big deal as then that if you do legalize marijuana, we would prefer that you get people out of prison who've been in jail for that and expunge their records. And he fast-tracked both of those, which is something that we weren't expecting, but we greatly appreciated because, it's always been this point of consternation with the African American community and even other people of color in the Latino community is that when white people get rich on marijuana legalization, black people are still in prison for it and they still have it on their record, and it keeps them from being able to do things when now people are now making millions off of it legally. And so they reconcile that immediately at the same time they legalized it, and in some ways before they actually have a real way of implementing the legalization process, because you still can't sell it, you can just have it, because they still haven't figured out that part, and they're still trying to deliberate how they're going to do that in what we are particularly as a control state, because we don't have like liquor stores. It has to be bought through the state in one of the state sanctioned liquor stores. So it's going to be a pretty interesting process to see it get out, but he's been doing that amongst other things, and so he's been very agreeable to those processes. Not so much that we're like, oh yeah, he's a hero, but he's trying very hard to mitigate that and trying not that to be his legacy moving forward. And I think that's the true answer of where that is.
Hearing you say it's going to be close makes me think it's going to be close. So this is definitely something that we will be looking at. It would be, I think, I already feel a lot of ill omens for Democrats in 2022, and this would sort of just cement all of the thinking, I think, the pessimists in us think about that. But speaking of politics and pessimism and we're all going to die, Mario, we have talked on the show about the flooding in Germany and the kind of incomplete promises of the CDU, the conservative government there when it comes to climate. We've also talked about the election and kind of the Greens' rise and fall based on a lot of first dissatisfaction with Merkel's succession process, and then dissatisfaction with Baerbock, the leader of the Green Party, on various mini scandals that don't even really add up to much. But now, are these things, my question to you is, are these things coming together? Are there flood voters who are actually going to vote because we have elections in September? Are there people who are going to vote based on this now bread and butter or not abstract issue?
That is a pretty good question. I think in the region, there are going to be people who might otherwise have voted CDU who might now not. Out of my personal experience, this has not really permeated or really convinced other people who otherwise are conservative to not cast their vote for the CDU in other regions of the country. Like you said in the introduction, I live north of where it happened in the region Hanover in Lower Saxony. Pretty rural area if you're just a little bit outside of Hanover. And there are a lot of conservative voters around here. And a lot of them are not really interested in hearing the criticism of Armin Laschet and the failure of the CDU in the last 16 years. They're big fans of Angela Merkel, for the most part, and for them the CDU is just their party. They vote more along party lines because they're used to it, less than actual conviction in the politics represented by the party. And I think that is one of the major problems the Green Party is facing. They also have a lack of infrastructure in especially Eastern Germany, but also in several rural areas in Western Germany. And this gives the CDU and among older voters also the SPD a huge advantage. And speaking of older voters, last statistic I looked at, 54% of the German electorate is above the age of 50. So because Germany is a very old country and older voters in general tend to vote more conservative and tend to vote more, the CDU has a big advantage that and the Green Party, like I said, because of all this, is so far not really capable of capitalizing on all the mistakes that Laschet has made in the last few weeks.
Yeah, he's not a great candidate. I mean, I think anyone observing German politics would say that all the major parties picked the exact wrong person to stand in the election, which, you know, either makes for a great or a terrible election. I mean, it's almost a foregone conclusion with sort of, you know, with the status quo press coverage that CDU hangs on and conservative kind of coalition in some fashion, with the Greens playing some kind of role. But do you see anything that can happen between now and then changing that trajectory? You were speaking before, maybe you could tell folks about kind of COVID scandal in the schools, which I do think that parents and kids in schools are a driver in elections.
If anything can really change things, it's first of all, one of the things the Green Party is failing to do is go in on the offensive. They have been so much on the defensive in the last few weeks that they have completely failed to go on the offensive regarding Armin Laschet's mismanagement in relation to the flood. And this week it came out that the SPD-led coalition government with the Green Party is a junior government, but it's an SPD-led state government in the city of Hamburg, which is both a city and a state. They ordered last November, I think, a study from a university in Hamburg, I think even the University of Hamburg itself, in the name of the Federal Council of the State Education Ministers, or Bundeskultusministerkonferenz, how we call it. And they're now suppressing the result of the study, claiming that it would endanger the relation of the city of Hamburg with the other German states and also the standing on international level. Nobody knows exactly what that means. For me personally, I believe that the study did not show what the educational ministers wanted it to show. They wanted the study to show, and they announced that when they ordered the study last year, that schools are not a driving factor in the spread of COVID-19. And the study most likely found the opposite. And now they don't want to release it. If the Green Party was clever on the federal level, they would jump on both an SPD mayor and minister president not doing his job, another SPD minister president, Malu Dreyer, also having failed in the flood response, and the CDU chair and chancellor nominee, who is the minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, also having failed with its job. But they don't do that.
Julie, you were trying to jump in. Did you have a question or a comment?
I was just going to say that's the exact same situation that we've seen in the U.S., which is that they wanted to reopen the schools. We know that's a big factor in reopening the economy and getting parents back to work. There really weren't any studies that showed it was safe, but we were told over and over again, yeah, it's safe, it's not a driving factor. I think anybody with two brain cells to rub together was like, well, does that really make sense? Kids bring home diseases all the time. It's kind of like the main thing they do when they get home from school is give you diseases. So, yeah, I mean, we've had the same issue here where we've been repeatedly assured that it wasn't a driver of infections, and now, you know, it's coming out that it has been. And that, of course, to kind of segue into another topic we were going to talk about, was not the only thing the CDC and the U.S. government has been backtracking on when it comes to COVID. We've now seen just in the last couple days, you know, the reimposition of mask mandates, as well as we're seeing that breakthrough infections are probably not as rare as they told us, and that even a fully vaccinated person can transmit the virus.
I mean,
there was, by the way, also presentation, a PowerPoint presentation leaked in quotation marks. The Bild, Germany's biggest newspaper. It's basically a right-wing
rag. Yeah.
It's I almost would feel bad to compare the New York Post to it.
No, that's the
New York Post.
That's right. That's the analog.
I would actually more put it on the level with the National Enquirer, but and that's how bad I see the Bild. They reported on this PowerPoint presentation of the RKI, basically the German CDC, and they recommend basically we should try positive reinforcement to increase willingness to get vaccinated. This idea that masks should not longer be required is not really that clever, and so on. And they tried, this is a scandal, and they are trying to keep this secret until after the election, that they want to continue to take away Germans' freedoms and all of this. And it's so goddamn ridiculous, but of course this paper would push that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say Germany and America famously have the highest kind of conspiracy-believing public. Like QAnon does the best in both those places.
We call them Quade.
But these things don't help. So in the U.S., we just had the CDC reverse their mask ban, and maybe they had good reasons to say we didn't need it, and maybe they have good reasons to say we need it now. But just the uproar it causes amongst people who feel like they're being lied to. I mean, Julia, this is right. This is a major problem.
It's a major problem. I mean, one thing that's been proposed recently is, as you were saying, positive reinforcement, so paying people to get the vaccine. I'm not against that. I mean, one thing that I think Biden announced that he's encouraging states to give like $100 to someone who gets a vaccine. That's not enough. I think it should be like another $2,000 check that goes to everyone that gets the vaccine. Let's be honest. If we can raise the military budget $80 billion anytime we want, we can afford to do this. Like, the anti-vaxxers are one major problem when it comes to achieving herd immunity and sort of tamping down these new variants, which are going to continue to pop up as we continue to see the virus spread and mutate. The other big issue, though, is still the fact that most people on Earth, I think only 13% of people on the planet have even one shot. So if we cannot get these shots to people around the world, which we are showing no interest in doing, it doesn't really matter what happens with our vaccinated and unvaccinated populations. I mean, it does, but in terms of COVID being a thing that we just have to deal with for the rest of our lives and having mask mandates come and go and shutdowns come and go, that's not going to get resolved until we actually work to get vaccines to everyone on the planet. And right now, it seems like there's literally no interest in that or understanding of the way that these variants develop and then get to be dangerous. So even if everyone in the Western world were vaccinated tomorrow, if we still have 80% of the world's population largely unvaccinated, we're going to see the rise of variants that are vaccine resistant. So your vaccine's not going to matter. You should care about what's happening in the rest of the world.
And speaking of things America delivers to the rest of the world, this is going to be an extremely cynical transition. We just saw Daniel Hale get 45 years in prison.
No. 45 months. 45 months.
45 months. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Let's be correct. Let's be correct. In fact, why don't I just turn it over to anyone who wants to talk about this? But this is about civilian death counts when it comes to drone strikes delivered, with love from the United States.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a super shameful thing that the U.S. has been doing over the last 10 or so years, which is prosecuting whistleblowers. Obviously there is legislation that's intended to protect whistleblowers, but the Espionage Act, which was first used against Edward Snowden, has now become like the in vogue way of making sure that we can prosecute people who leak things that are embarrassing to the government. So the Espionage Act was passed in 1917. This was a World War I era law that was intended to keep people from leaking things that were going to be damaging to us during that war. Yeah. Now it's being used, very cynically to prosecute people who are leaking things that I personally believe are the public's right to know and are incredibly embarrassing to the government. So as you were saying, a lot of the documents that were leaked, they're about how these drone strikes, they're not as highly targeted as we were told. As someone who's involved in this program, he's said that basically a lot of times when you're a part of a drone strike, it's like 9 out of 10 people that are killed are just innocent bystanders. That's, according to him, was the incentive for him to come forward. He also leaked documents about how the U.S. decides to put people on watch lists, which again has been this totally opaque process. Trump definitely also was using the Espionage Act following in the footsteps of Obama, and now Biden is being continuous with the Trump administration and how we're using this legislation to prosecute people who are bringing things to light that are actually super crucial for the public to know. I mean, if we go back to Snowden, he was prosecuted essentially for letting the public know that the government does, as a lot of conspiracy theorists thought over the years, have access to all of our cameras, any phone camera, any laptop camera. If they ever need to access things in your devices, they can get a retroactive warrant to look back at things that you said years ago, all stuff that's just totally unconstitutional. So instead of thanking Edward Snowden, obviously he was fled the country. Another thing I want to add about the Snowden leaks in particular is that the party line about why it was important to prosecute Snowden is that he was putting people at risk. Snowden actually didn't make any decisions about which documents would be public. That's why he worked with The Intercept and he worked with major news outlets to determine what was newsworthy according to major news outlets that were sort of things that the public had a right to know, as opposed to something that was just sort of scandalous or really just secret. So that was not a decision that Snowden even made in terms of what would be public. That was decisions that were made by major news organizations. And what I think is really cynical and disgusting is when you see the Washington Post or outlets like that who actually covered Snowden's leaks and made decisions about what to put into the paper, then implying that Snowden put people at risk with his leaks, because the Washington Post editorial board is the one who decided what would actually be public, was the one who decided what should be in their paper. And so it makes no sense to blame Snowden for that. And honestly, I think it really undercuts the argument that you see, among journalists that They're being so pushed out by fake news. Like they, all they want is a free and fair open media. And then to see them really stand by and watch these crimes and atrocities be committed against people who are releasing information that's useful to the public and that exposes war crimes of the U.S. government, it just sounds like a bunch of whining. I mean, you don't care then. If you don't care about war crimes committed by the U.S. government and you don't want to cover those and you think that it's a crime to cover them, then that's not what a press is supposed to do. In your magical fairyland where the press is holding the government accountable.
I think, and Jamaa, I would love to know your opinion on it. I mean, I was talking on Nomi's show, I think it was last night. I keep, who can say? Time is a flat, whatever. Just about how, especially national security folks, people like Joe Biden are so steeped in sort of 50 years of thinking that it's one thing to be sort of transformative in this economic infrastructure way. I can remember back the New Deal, we did that. But then there's things where, and again, we're being cynical here, whether it's as important as the morality of our foreign policy or something as simple as legalizing marijuana, it's just people are stuck in 50 years of no one ever lost a vote, busting a kid for smoking a joint. No one ever lost a vote, putting an extra cop on the street. I mean, I would even tie that in with DNC's incredibly strange efforts to tie defunding the police to Republicans, which is, I think, a losing strategy and also bizarre.
It's very bizarre. There's a couple of things that I still believe very much that the Democratic Party thinks that it's 1980s, demographics. And
absolutely.
I think a lot of them are still very much licking the wounds from when Mondale got trounced by Reagan. And that's when they ran scared from their traditional base. And they adopted a can't beat them, join them strategy. It says, we're now going to be conservative light from now on, and this is how we're going to win. Now, another part of me, I come from a military family, grandparents both serve in the military. With the Snowden piece and this guy, it's yes, you should hold our people accountable, but is giving sensitive information to the press to figure out what that is the best way to do that. There should have been mechanisms within the government that's accountable to other branches of the government that hasn't been happening. The Gang of Eight, there's a whole host of them. They should have been those levers that throttles down on that pushes back on the military for these things, and they realize, but ever since 9/11 they have been less a no, don't do that community, more than like, okay, we're just glad you told us how much more money do you want for this fucked up bombing thing that you're going to do. And that's basically where there was that huge switch over. And always our national policy has always been about, to me it's like, we're going to bomb the shit out of brown people, where are they? And so now that has now expanded to non-brown countries. And that's where a lot of people are like starting to freak out. It's like, you mean we're doing that to everybody? I'm like, of course we're spying on our allies. It's what we do. It's like, people are surprised to find out that the NSA spies on everybody. It's like literally their charge. If Al-Qaeda or drug dealers started using carrier pigeons, the NSA will be on top of every building with bird seed trying to intercept them damn carrier pigeons. It's literally their job. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
no, I mean, I think I'm well aware of that, but I think that for the people who are surprised by the leaks, like, let me give an example. I've been heavily critical of the media coverage of Russiagate because I think it's totally disconnected from the world we actually live in. The way that Russiagate was covered is that Russia was attempting to interfere in American election by buying ads on social media, and that this is something that is totally outside of the norm of the way that countries interact with each other, and that nobody spies on anybody, and it's really rude and mean, and that they should, we should bomb them or we should destroy them because it's just totally unheard of when it comes to the ethics of the global community. That's the way the press covered it. And I believe that people in the press are either actively suppressing what they know the CIA and the NSA do to write these stories, or they're just incredibly ignorant. And either way, they're not serving people in the way they're covering this story. So, like the New York Times had this massive coverage of Russiagate that was like Putin invented disinformation, or the KGB invented disinformation. And it's like, okay, well, the word you're talking about, basically what you mean is propaganda and lying, and it's been around since politicians have been around. And if we're going to talk about, you know, who has done the most regime change and election interference, I mean, this is even at a time where the U.S. is continuing to interfere in Latin America, you know, helping with this SOS Cuba campaign, you know, that we're trying to overthrow the government of Cuba, as we have been for 70 years. You know, in the midst of all this, we're sort of getting our panties in a twist about the idea that Russia would want to interfere in someone else's election. So to me, it's like, you know, yes, you're right. The CIA and the NSA, that is all they do. That is what they do. They spy on people. But it's pretty clear that the U.S. public doesn't understand that. They haven't gotten that message, because I don't know what they think the CIA does, but they think that we just spread democracy and justice and we never do anything wrong. So I think like the more that they get this information, the better.
You know, one thing that actually is a practical thing that can actually be legislated pretty easily is putting back, and this is one of the things that, like, I'm not sure I believe there ever was like a functioning kind of self-accountability mechanism in our foreign policy, except maybe for internal competition. Like, not to like sound like some kind of crazy like crypto libertarian. I do think actually the wall that exists between the military and the intelligence community that used to exist was important. It's eroded now. And I think a lot of people don't know that the military is actually required to provide assistance for CIA operations, which was not normal, which was not something that, you know, a CIA operative could usually expect. Yeah, and so this is something that has actually legally changed, that should be changed back, because it would actually just provide, it's not going to change the trajectory of the blob when it comes to foreign policy, but it actually is one of these, like, there's a million of these sort of small practical things that actually should be done, so we can even know if our current guardrails do work or if they're just fictions to begin with, because it's sort of hard to point to the times when they're doing their thing.
About the separation between military and intelligence agencies, maybe since Cuba was brought up, one of the reasons why the Bay of Pigs invasion failed was that it was an entire CIA operation, and JFK told the CIA, you're not going to get military support. Either your plan works or it fails. I'm not going to send in the Marines or the Air Force or whatever. You do this on your own.
And anyone who studies coups know you need a little push. You need a little help, you know? None of this stuff can ever happen with just the 20 guys on the beach.
Well, yeah,
Absolutely.
insider help, I feel
and
like,
I think
is usually the best in a coup.
And an embassy, right?
Yeah,
Somebody's got to be in the
people who
basement.
actually
Embassy, but in the administration. No, if I could also say something about that SOS Cuba shit, the thing that they kept, you know, they were talking about how there were all these protests. And by the way, a few things that the mainstream media did around these protests. One, they showed protests in Miami and implied they were in Cuba.
Yeah.
Two, they showed pro-government protests on Fox News and blocked out the signs so that you couldn't see they were pro-government. Three, they used images of the Arab Spring and claimed it was Cuba. But even aside from all that, I think it's really important for Americans to look at the way that those protests were covered versus like the protests that are happening in Brazil right now. You know, I think the numbers we heard from Cuba were like 1,400 people died in a week from COVID. At the same time, you know, in the U.S., we had months where 3,000 people were dying a day, and nobody suggested coming in and cooing our government. Similarly, in Brazil, you know, they've had the worst COVID pandemic on earth, and there are massive, massive protests against Bolsonaro. But of course, there is no American-based #SOS Brazil campaign to go in and depose Bolsonaro. Similarly, India, you know, India had reported 400,000 deaths from COVID. We're now hearing that it's more like 4 million, although the government is denying that. They think it's underestimated by a factor of 10. So 4 million deaths from COVID. No SOS India campaign to depose Modi. There were campaigns to provide aid. There were campaigns to provide aid to India. So I would love to see campaigns to provide aid to Cuba, because that's what we can do that's actually helpful at this time. But I think it's important for the U.S. citizens to contrast what we see about our allies versus our nations that we want to change the government of how those things are covered. I don't think that there's going to be a campaign to depose Bolsonaro. I think that we like him okay.
And they also need to understand that people of Cuba,
Did
when they're
Bolsonaro
protesting,
recently
they're
meet with the
protesting.
CIA director?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Jamaa, go ahead.
I was saying that the people of Cuba, like the other thing they understand, like they're protesting because the prices are going up in a capitalist system. They're not saying, oh, this communism thing works. They're mad that it's actually getting more expensive to get like food and medicine and the things that they need to survive because they're dealing with a capitalist crisis in Cuba.
It's also the ultimate irony that they actually controlled the pandemic pretty well for, quite a long time. And, it was the irresponsibility of the Western world in failing to properly lock down that has led to this continued spread and the development of all these variants. And now we're sort of victim blaming poor areas which are having difficulties handling the continued influx of new variants.
And it makes one wonder, especially when you even have Joe Biden speaking towards economic sanctions being a form of violence. You seem to be ratcheting it up on Cuba. Again, I think it's 50 years of being steeped in something. But you wonder if we will ever extend internationally the idea of pandemic in the same way we do as war, being like, you should not be able to have a blockade during a pandemic. This is an international emergency. Certain kinds of economic sanctions are just no longer viable when we have a global supply chain in which, as Julia says, if we don't take care of a good, huge portion of the world, everybody's screwed.
Especially your neighbors. And that's the part that's making me crazy. I'm like, look, everybody's talking about, oh my God, the people with COVID are coming in, they're refugees from these other countries. I'm like, if you make sure your neighbors are taken care of, which you should be number one, because you have a dog in that fight, as well as the neighbors' neighbors and everybody else, this thing moves quickly. Y'all can go back to the way you can get to some sort of facsimile to how it was before. And here's the news I want to break to these people. We're not going back to the way it was before. The whole globalized, we're going to exploit these low-income places for more profits and basically pull that back to the narrow edge of their survivability so we can optimize profits. That shit is gone. It's never coming back, because even them seeing how stupid that literally one a perpendicular parked ship shut down trade for like, I don't know what, like months, because you have your supply chain, so much of it is another country, so you can exploit international labor. And now the tech companies had the gall and audacity to hit up Congress and saying, we need to have more plants in America to build that out, and we need money to do that after you've exploited that for jillions of dollars. And Apple doing that is absolutely ridiculous, where they are still making money hand over fist, and they could pay for it themselves, but let's see if we can get the government to pay for it. You know what I'm saying? So it puts me in a fit of rage to see, like, you have set up this situation that was incredibly brittle, that is not durable, that could not stand up to a pandemic, and now you're trying to accelerate people to go back to work and risk their lives and their families, and it still hasn't been fully remedied. And not only that, you wanted to go back before to the way where you were optimally making revenue at the expense of them, and you're really upset with them when they're not going back to work on the timetable you want to, in the circumstance you want to, and leaving those jobs. And so I'm like, if nobody participates or decides that this is the place they want to go to anymore, they're not going to go back. And they need to understand that is that. Now, the flip side problem here is that we're not prepared to exploit that, and nobody who has been opposing that stuff for decades has been able to articulate a policy vision that is an alternative to that everybody wins. And that's my frustration with my side of the aisle.
I mean,
you know what I'm saying?
I think you're right. I think it's optimistic, but I think we do hope, and we've said on the show a couple of times, that maybe one of the things coming out of the pandemic is just it's taken the edge off of some of the most laissez-faire tendencies of the most laissez-faire class politically, if not in actuality, but that remains to be seen. 100%. Julie, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to say goodbye.
I feel like ideologically, these people are very married to returning to the way things were. I mean,
they're going to try.
They're going to try. But that being said, I just saw an article in like Forbes the other day that was about employers being really upset because the Delta variant has now disrupted their plan to make people go back to work immediately and, go back to the office. I think it's almost this like spiritual lesson that we're like refusing to learn as a society, and we're just going to keep getting hammered until we learn it. It's like, it's just like climate change, where it's like, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want and I don't have to worry about other people and it's not going to affect me. And it is going to affect you. It's going to affect you. It's going to keep affecting you. Your life is going to suck. Even if you're a multi-billionaire pharma exec, I don't think you want to live in lockdown for the rest of your life. I don't think that you want your kids not to be able to go to school. Even if you have all the help in the world, not being able to do whatever you want to do all the time, which is what you're used to, is an inconvenience to you. So why don't you figure out what steps you need to take to get back to your normality? Because it's going to involve caring for a community of people.
Xhevat, let's clip that last part and send it to our billionaire listserv so we can get all of them on that. Okay? Perfect. Appreciate you. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Jamaa. And we will talk to all of you soon.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
You drink a lot during the show.
I do?
Julia. You drink from beverages, because I watch now that I'm editing more, I watch in fast forward, and so it's funny, I see everybody, and it's like...
That's so that I'm not...
The different mugs come up. We should brand the mugs. This is a branding opportunity.
Agree, but that's so that my ADD, so I'm not doing anything else. I'm not going to be like fidgeting if I'm not drinking something.
We call this business. Yeah, you got to give actors business with their hands so so they have things to do. It's why cigarettes were so good on screen until people got really worked up about it. It looked good.
I could smoke on the show if you want.
I think maybe we should. I think maybe that would be
good. But I want like a cigarette holder. I want to be glam.
I think all
marijuana
this is
legal
doable.
in Virginia now. We could totally just like roll up a joint and call it a day in Virginia.
Things are getting better. Not here in Germany. It's like not even on the table.
Hi, and welcome to your Global News Rodeo, which is our roundup of current events happening all over the world as curated by the show's own Forrest Lovette. Now from Alabama, usually here with me in Berlin. This is more than you need to know. Let's go. Item 1, short end of the tongue depressor. Nurses strike for better conditions. The Guardian is reporting a wave of nurses' strikes and demonstrations across the U.S. Thousands of nurses have been picketing in front of hospitals for understaffing issues, about equipment shortages, and to the general poor working conditions they've had ever since the COVID-19 pandemic began. More than 700 nurses have been on strike at St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. A 20-year veteran nurse at the hospital was quoted saying, "Most of us felt like we went from heroes to zeros quickly. After working through breaks, working multiple shifts, and suffering layoff and furloughs, these frontline heroes are using solidarity to say, enough." Yeah, see, I told you it was something weird. It's like it is the ugliest expression of the American language. Massachusetts. Item 2, let my people go. Mexican president frees certain prisoners. NPR reports Mexican President López Obrador has issued a decree to free a select group of federal prison inmates by September 15th. The list of freed prisoners includes inmates over the age of 75, those over 65 with chronic illnesses, and those who have been victims of torture. The president made a statement on the issue saying, "We do not want torture. No one deserves to be tortured. No one. We cannot continue with these medieval practices, completely contrary to the most basic human rights." López Obrador was elected in 2018 and has taken a softer stance on criminal justice and drug policies than his predecessors. I mean, look, the other way is not working, so I think we should give the president a chance. 3, tumultuous time in Tunisia. Government sacked amid unrest. The Socialist Worker reports the Tunisian government has been sacked by the current president, Kais Saied. Under extreme pressure from protests and riots in response to poverty, police brutality, and the rising coronavirus cases and vaccine shortages, the prime minister was fired and parliament was suspended. The tempers in the country haven't been cooled in the 10 years since the Tunisian revolution in 2010 that overthrew the then dictator Ben Ali. The rate of unemployed is 18%, and Said's continued broken promises of reform have driven the North African nation to the tipping point. And as you remember, so many people said during the Arab Spring, because you remember Tunisia was the good one, the one that was, it's about delivering social services to people. Everything else is just window dressing. Item 4, cheeky bastards, Amazon fined by European authority. Political Europe is reporting that Amazon is being fined 746 million euros by Luxembourg Data Protection Authority, or the CNPD. The megacorporation has once again refused to comply with EU privacy rules and general data protection regulations. Unsurprisingly, Amazon is objecting to the ruling and has issued a statement regarding their intended appeal. We believe the CNPD's decision to be without merit and intended to defend ourselves vigorously in this matter. The data breach deals with how Amazon displays advertising information to its customers. Item number 5, Ethiopian humanitarian crisis, millions in need of aid. The Anadolu Agency is reporting that humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia has reached a horrendous high. The war-torn region of Tigray has experienced unprecedented casualties during an 8-month-long conflict. Now, the UN says essential services in the region have been decimated, with 5.2 million people, or 90% of the population, in need of acute humanitarian assistance. UNICEF is estimating that as many as 100,000 children could suffer life-threatening malnutrition in the next year. The UN has lost access to refugee camps as the Ethiopian government continues to fight for control with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And humanitarian aid is vitally needed. I would encourage anyone, who has any ability to do so to try to donate, but also to really read a wide variety of news sources about what is happening on the ground. Item 6, no mas. Castillo officially wins in Peru. NPR reports that Pedro Castillo has finally won the Peruvian presidency outright. The victory comes after the country's longest electoral count in 40 years. 44,000 votes were all that separated the leftist Castillo and the far-right candidate Keiko Fujimori. A rural teacher, Castillo is said to be the first peasant to become president of Peru. Wasting no time, Castillo was already named as prime minister and now has the task of tackling the debilitating poverty that has ravaged the country. Peru is the second largest producer of copper in the world, and Castillo and his supporters have rallied around his slogan, "No more poor in a rich country." And we certainly wish him and his new government every success as they try to turn things around. Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary, and this is Smart Club. Today, we are going to talk about Kosovo, specifically the Corona coup and how the young nation has dealt with the virus. It's a place we've talked about in different contexts before, but we're really going to drill in deep today. Although America and Kosovo are close allies and the U.S. played a pivotal role in Kosovar independence from Serbia, many in the U.S. will not be familiar with the current politics of Kosovo, and frankly, were a bit baffled by the unsteady press conference in which Richard Grenell, Donald Trump's main man in Middle Europe, declared a breakthrough peace treaty between Serbia and Kosovo. And then somehow a lake was named after Donald Trump. It really was all a mess that Zizek called the Corona coup. And of course, how Europe's youngest nation has dealt with a pandemic has been a core column of the story. With us to discuss COVID, the Corona coup, and Kosovo are Orgesa Arifi, former committee employee, and I should say, but currently she is working communications at the Health Ministry of Kosovo, and Arber Zaimi, who is an activist, campaigner, and a communicator for the Vetvendosa movement. I should say that all three of us have worked together very closely on Vetvendosa campaigns, and so we're definitely coming at this with a point of view, which I think is clear, and yet we will still be extremely informative and helpful. Okay. So, Arber, if I can start with you, and if I can ask you to set the stage for folks, the party that you and I both support came to power in an election we both worked in. What was the opening in Kosovo politics that made Vetvendosa appealing enough to win a vote? You know, this was a huge expansion for them from being a leftist, progressive kind of movement into actually being part of the coalition for power. You can even take us through the last sort of decade as quickly as you can.
Hello, Arun, and thank you for this invitation in your show. And hello, Orgesa, too. It's nice to see you. And I will shortly go back through some years because Kosovo has a tragic history which is very recent, actually. Your public, your viewers, they probably come from the States and they don't know much about Kosovo. Kosovo is one of the countries of the world with the most Philo-American tendency in the population, in the public opinion, and people need to know why. Everybody knows that the US led the coalition of countries and the NATO into the liberation of Kosovo in the war of '99. But what was going on back then? Very shortly, I will tell that some numbers about that conflict. So there was a general offensive by Serbia, which colonized Kosovo for, let's say, 90 years or something. And in this general offensive, in the years 98 and 99, there were more than 1 million people from Kosovo, Albanians from Kosovo, which were expulsed from their country. So basically there was ethnic cleansing, and there is a documented sexual assault of over 20,000 women from military, police, and paramilitary troops from Serbia. And there was the burning of over 130,000 homes of Albanian families, the killing of more than 12,000 civilians, and the disappearance of many people, of which almost 1,600 are still missing. So in the year 99, as I said, a coalition of countries led by the states intervened to free Kosovo. And then this is the main reason why everybody here is so much pro-American. And it's our own main ally in the world politics. Of course, we know that Kosovo is a very tiny country and a little country, but still we see America, which is the most powerful country of the world, let's say, we see this our best friend. They helped us survive. They helped us stop an actual ethnic cleansing policy that was going on. When it comes to the economic situation, I will just give some brief numbers for people to understand what's the situation in Kosovo, because when we speak about the Balkans, it's a region full of economic hardship, and we all know about the global crisis of the economy that started in 2008 is not going back. But still, Kosovo is one of the most underdeveloped places in the Balkans, one of the most underdeveloped countries in Europe. So the median wage in Kosovo is about $350, but the unemployment is really high. We are talking about an unemployment which is higher in real numbers, higher than 45%. Women unemployment, real unemployment, is higher than 80%. And youth unemployment is higher than 65%. So basically, this is the situation where our movement started to work. The movement was founded in 2005 from around 70 activists coming from different backgrounds. Some of them were environmental activists or climate activists, as someone would call them today. Some of them were working rights activists. Some of them were anti-colonial or decolonial activists and so on. So they came together to start Vetvendos in 2005. Back then we were a movement, a non-governmental movement, which was mainly protesting in the streets. We were not even thinking on going into parliamentary politics. We started the first step in that direction in 2010. This is the first time that Vetvendos participated as a movement in the parliamentarian elections. And I remember I was back then working for Vetvendos. I still am. I am a member of the presidency. So in 2010, we got around 12% of the vote. And that's our start. In 2021, which is 11 years later, we won a decisive victory of more than 50% of the voters' support. Of course, it's 11 years full of troubles for the movement and a lot of funny moments too. But there were also a lot of risks that we ran. We had to fight with local corrupted politicians, but sometimes we also had to struggle against international politicians who were also corrupt or willing to work with local corrupt politicians. And in 2019 was our first victory. Arun, you were part of that electoral campaign, so we worked together there. In 2019, we received almost 30% of the vote. We were the biggest parliamentarian party in Kosovo. It was very difficult for us to form a movement. We had to join forces with LDK, which is a center-rightist party. But we managed to keep our program, which is, I don't know if people see, probably they don't. In my background, the three words is equality, justice, and development. So we are a social democratic party, and we are working for these three goals to start happening in Kosovo. Now we have our government. We didn't need to go into an alliance mode in the elections of this year, but that happened only after we managed to navigate through a crisis in 2020. We will probably talk about that later when we go into the details of the Trump government intervention in Kosovo.
Yeah, which we will get to. But so Orgesa, there's this kind of big generational changeover in government, and even with a coalition with the center right, it's kind of this changing of the guard, right, from the traditional Kosovo parties to something new and social democratic and progressive looking at the same time. In the other corner, we see a pandemic just beginning to enter into people's consciousness. Even as this coalition is forming, it's just sort of starting in Milan and Bergamo, and it hasn't even entered Kosovo yet, but people are talking about it as the government's taking power. So it really is fresh. How was that as an experience for the country and also for the governing party?
Thank you for the invitation, Arun. It's a pleasure to speak with you guys again. Well, just to mention that in the first Kurti government, I wasn't a part of it, so I was looking at it as a citizen. And when the first cases started to appear in Kosovo, I felt a bit insecure. But when I saw the minister and the prime minister and the new government, I felt way more comfortable. And the situation that was going on after 2 and 3 cases in Kosovo, finally, because we were waiting for the new cases to show up, since everywhere in the world infections were happening. So after, I think, 2 months, we hear about a coup, and everybody gets frustrated and very, very scary, because the pandemic has been hitting us very hard, economically, psychologically, and in every aspect. So the coup was, in my opinion, very, except frustrating, but very nasty in a way. And that's why in the 14th of February 2021, we won again. So as a result,
I mean, but I think playing politics in a pandemic really, is sort of like you're saying, as a regular person trying to live your life, is super upsetting. But let's unpack for people who don't know much about what the coup was, and Trump's government. We should dig into that. I do think so. I mean, as these politics was happening, and I'll open it up to either of you who want to talk about it, though, like, were cases under control? Was it spiraling? Like, what were some of the government measures that were in place versus the neighbor states, if you can remember?
I can explain the cases, but the political side, Arber is the most informed.
Yeah. We can do a 1-2 on that.
The cases in Kosovo in the beginning were a bit more in control, and right after the new cases were exposed in Kosovo, we faced lockdown and new measures.
Pretty aggressive.
But the measures were very creative. We would go out for 90 minutes a day, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere else but to pharmacy or get some food or something like that. But the stress level was kind of balanced before the coup came and happened.
So, I mean, we're referring to a procedural coup, which is triggered by a vote of no confidence. Arber, can you unpack sort of what led to that vote? Obviously, you do have a fragile coalition. It's only a one vote majority in parliament. What do people mean when they say coup?
Well, it happened. We started the government in 2020 after we managed to conclude an agreement with LDK. We started in March 25th of last year. And right away we had to deal with kind of an arm twist, if I can use this word, from the Trump representative in the Balkans, in the negotiations between
folks will be
Serbia
familiar
and
with
Kosovo,
him.
Richard Grenell. And we faced a lot of pressure, which was very unfair to us, because the logics of that pressure was okay, now you have to forget about your past, of all those things that I said, all those things that I mentioned, killed people, raped women, which are still living into hardship, houses burned, hundreds of thousands of properties destroyed. And you have to forget about this, which happened only 20 years ago, and you have to start making trade and commerce with a country that would still repeat it if it had the chance, with a country that does not want to recognize Kosovo. In 2007, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, said that Kosovo is right to declare independence. So we even have international institutions recognizing Kosovo's right. In 2008, Kosovo declared independence. Today, Kosovo is recognized from more than 117 states of the UN, which are also the democratic states of the world, the more democratic states of the world, let's say. And still we got that pressure to start making trade with a country that is
and it seemed like it's very ideologically, I think, aligned with kind of with the right wing of the U.S., right? This was a sort of a free trade situation rather than the word I believe the Prime Minister kept using was they wanted a reciprocal agreement, and this was the sticking point, right?
What would happen if we would force victims to start trading or making business with the perpetrators of violence in other circumstances? Because we know that recognizing victimhood is a process, is the start of a process to bring justice. But what if we force victims to say, okay, forget about the rape that happened, now you have to start business as usual with the rapist? This is something that even emotionally cannot be accepted. But of course we couldn't accept it also because it would threaten our sovereignty as a country, our economy and our welfare. We had Serbia, and we still have it, which time after time raises these non-tariff barriers towards products and commerce coming from Kosovo. And we wanted to make some pressure on Serbia. We also wanted to raise the international awareness of what is going on, so that they could see that this relation is not fair. We want to bring fairness into the Serbia-Kosovo relationship. We want to achieve recognition. This is also something that the actual president of the US, Joe Biden, said. He said that we should work for mutual recognition between Serbia and Kosovo. Of course, when we talk about US presidents, we are very much aware that presidents coming from the Republican Party, as well as presidents coming from the Democratic Party, have helped Kosovo. But this was not the case with the Grenell process and with the Trump presidency. They basically started working with a mentality which is very much Huntingtonian in a sense, but extremely Huntingtonian. So there is this history of Albanians being a majority Muslim country, and they started saying that Albanians are an Arab country. But this is a mishmash history. This could not even be taken seriously. So we had this kind of things. We started to be worried about this, and then they started working with corrupt politicians from the old parties in Kosovo. So they at one moment achieved some kind of majority with the opposition by breaking the governing coalition with LDK, and then they, let's say, set up a coup. This is what happened. It was the middle of the pandemics, and we were working very well. We managed to have, in the beginning of May, 0 cases. I'm talking about 2020. It was hell everywhere in the Balkans and in Europe. We managed to have 0 cases. But still, they didn't care about this. They just wanted us down. Still, what we had to do at that moment, we were facing a tough choice. If we would start a demonstration, then it would even more put the lives of the people in risk at the time of the pandemic. So we decided to wait and see what happens. We knew that there would be elections in America in autumn, and of course it was very clear for us which of the 2 candidates we should support, also because of ideological let's say convictions, because we are a social democratic party. So we gave this message to the Albanian Americans: for patriotic reasons they should support Joe Biden after what Trump did with Grenell in the year 2020 to Kosovo.
Yeah, no, and sort of even the most embarrassing kind of asterisk on this is the lake name for Trump that sort of, happened as some sort of homage. But Orgesa, what can you tell me? Yeah, no, really bad, right? Like even for everything else, that's like particularly just like, what can you tell us about then what happened in terms of Corona policy and Corona results during the pandemic with the new LGK-led government, the Houthi-led government?
We started to demonstrate from our balconies with pots and pans. We put some flags naming that we won,
socially distanced.
we won new elections, and we do not want this new government that doesn't care about the citizens' public health. And as expected, this governance relaxed the measures, and the number of cases were rising day after day. The curfew was, shrinking from time to time, and but as citizens, we would still be hoping whether they are working on new contracts with companies producing vaccines, but that didn't happen either. So the only thing we ever experienced as citizens during those days of lockdown and the pandemic, without any restriction actually, is the fact that we took some sort of, how do we say, some taxes of 10% from the Ministry of Finance, and that was some sort of like a reason that they're working. But in the other side, we weren't feeling secure at all, because we knew that the vaccines are not in their plan at all.
Let me ask you that, why do you think the government was relaxing some of these restrictive measures? Is it sort of just a popularity play? Was there a segment of the population who was excited about this?
Yes, because during when they came in office, it was during summer, and diaspora was visiting, as always, Kosovo. So they would come from countries that were, developing the British new variant of COVID, and economically it would help Kosovo, but not in a health way, in our public health. So that's why they were relaxing the measures. But at the end of the day, even though we had a curfew from 10 to 5, these people weren't respecting it, and the inspectors weren't that strict with the orders. And apparently everybody just went with their lives as if there was no pandemic, because the government itself wouldn't give you that message.
And also maybe there was like tourism folks or hospitality folks probably were behind some pushing,
yes.
as we've seen
all the time with them. So you would have clubs, open air clubs, but Kosovo is a tiny country in terms of comparing it with United States. So we know each other. We know which business is linked with LDK or AK or PDK. So we would see how their businesses would be more active because of the relaxed measures. So it wasn't safe at all, but
and cases did go up.
They did go up. For example, in November, if I can recall, we almost had 2,000 active cases. Not active cases, new cases, because they differ. And 90 people lost their lives. So that's when we saw that we either have to save ourselves, because your government doesn't really pay attention to that.
Arber, can I ask you a little bit about, again, in the region, sort of Serbia has been playing a kind of very high-level game of vaccine diplomacy, right? They got some early from China and from Russia, and we saw people in the region even traveling to Serbia as kind of exercising soft power. Can you talk a little bit about that for the viewers, and also how Kosovo did or did not play into some of that because of the backdrop you've already given us?
Serbia started early vaccination in December. It was one of the first countries in the Balkans. It was the first country, but it was also one of the first countries in Europe to start vaccination. Of course, vaccination is good and everybody wants this, and we promote vaccination a lot. But the thing is that the previous government, the LDK government, as Orgesa might already have mentioned it, they didn't really have a plan on anything, but not even on vaccination or regarding the pandemics. So they didn't even start negotiations for a contract. We didn't find any contract already done from the previous government or any negotiation in process. So we started from the very beginning when we took the government in February. So Kosovo was a bit lagged behind. Also, we have to keep in mind that Kosovo decided to apply and stick to the regulations of the European health authorities and to not import vaccines which were not recognized by EU health authorities, even though we are not part of the EU, but we want to be part of the EU. So we want to follow those standards. So we decided not to accept vaccines coming from China or Russia, because at the time they were not licensed and accepted from the European institutions. Serbia did that, and it managed to have a very high vaccination percentage. But then apparently there were some vacillations with the vaccination. The Sinovac, it didn't come up as very efficient. Even Chinese authorities accepted that it was not very efficient. So even in Serbia, we had, unfortunately for that people there, we had a surge on cases, even though they were pretty much, a big percentage was vaccinated. When it comes to Kosovo, we worked a lot, and now we have contracts with Pfizer and AstraZeneca. We also were helped from many partner countries in Europe, but also from America. And now we started mass vaccination, and we aim to have more than 60% of the population vaccinated within this year. For the moment, right now, we are having a good result in this process. When it comes to diplomacy, we decided not to put into a jeopardy, let's say the geopolitical project to which Kosovo belongs to, which is that of the Western democracies. We have right now in the Balkans some initiatives to bring here Putin's Eurasian project, Euro-Asia, as they call it, Eurasia project. We don't accept that because we believe it threatens us, not only in a strict matter of state sense or geopolitical sense, but also it threatens our lives as human beings. We had previous experience of that kind of policy coming from Moscow or from Belgrade, which is echoing their, let's say, expansive colonialist projects from the 20th century. So we are not talking here about history which is very far in the past, but it's the 20th century. And we don't want that repeated. So we didn't want to jeopardize our geopolitical project. We want to be attached to the Western European countries and to NATO and to the US.
So some of these ambitious goals that Arber mentioned, Orgesa, how now you're no longer an observer, you are in the government. So I can even ask you in your official capacity, how are you doing with those goals, and what did you inherit coming into this position, and what are the main obstacles? All of those things at once. I'll remind you of any of them. Don't worry.
I'll start with the inheritance because that's the most important part that we have to mention. So when we came in the office, we basically found only a USB and a few documents, as if we were changing not governments but something less. Apartments, exactly. We saw that even by that time, when the whole world was creating commissions to create vaccination plan and all these conditions with the vaccination, with the vaccine producers, the LDK government didn't do anything up until the last part of the December. In the last week of December, they created the commission, who was a part of some professionals, and they created this vaccination plan, which is more or less copy paste and anything. So nothing happened, to be honest. And when we came in office, we had to do everything from scratch. The commission of the vaccination, the plan, and how do we get the Pfizer contract signed. But as we were continuing to work and doing a great job, because we finally signed the contract with 1.2 million vaccines in May, some journalists leaked a document which basically almost failed our contract with Pfizer company. As a result, we had a conference, and the minister called out the police, to interview how did these journalists get to this very, very fragile document. And so the opposition would always use this case to attack our minister as if he doesn't want to sign the contract. And in my opinion, as a part of this government, but at the same time as an observer, because you still live here and you want to see new things and good things happening to public health, I honestly still do not understand how irrational they are being as an opposition, because they're still attacking our minister as if he didn't want to sign a contract that would, first of all, gain us more votes, and of course that would be something better for us. And second, it would put our lives in danger if something else would have been leaked from that contract. So after that scandal, we signed the contract. Everybody's happy, and on 15th of June, we started mass vaccination, and we're planning to vaccinate 20,000 people all around Kosovo, our country. And the procedure is going okay. It can be even better, because we're facing now with misinformation.
This is what I wanted to ask you about. Yeah, set that up for us.
So as in everywhere in the world, misinformation are present in Kosovo as well. It's quite a challenge for every leader in the world to deal with this. So that's why our government is not talking only about vaccines by the minister's side, but also our prime minister is talking about vaccines all the time, and the president, since we have to get vaccinated since Delta is coming, and we're expecting in September that the cases might rise as well, because it's happening everywhere in the world, and we want to prevent that from happening. So it's not only a promise from our government, but it's also a promise to public health, and we need to stick to that plan, and we're doing fine. But yet again, the misinformation is expanding like Delta. But at the same time, the religious leaders are very cooperative with us, and Also, private businesses are promoting that.
So civic society is being the real
Yes,
kind of
yes.
yeah. Last question goes to Arber. Can you put this sort of misinformation in an even more context? What do you see politically happening? Who are the actors? Are there people deliberately stoking some of this, and who are they? Or is it more just a general churn that is the internet? Because you do have a very young, very online population in Kosovo. I think people should understand.
Yeah, it's true. There is also something global going on. We see people very angry after 4 decades of neoliberalism or the dominance of finance capitalism. So we should also understand, let's say, the pain that workers who are now unemployed are going through, because they are unemployed because a factory closed and they relocated to, I don't know, another country where they can exploit workers with a cheaper wage. We should understand this process. But some people, some politicians are working to make us believe that there are only 2 alternatives. One is neoliberalism, finance capitalism, the moving of the capital without restrictions and responsibilities and so on. And the other one is ultra-conservative, Putin-style authoritarianism. Some kind of mix, actually, between Putin and Berlusconi. Kind of a Stalin clown or something like this. And we shouldn't accept this binary alternative. No, we should find what's our interest and where we should move forward to. And I believe that we should understand that the people struggle for better healthcare, for better education in our country, for more work alternatives there, for fair trade, for a capitalism which is also responsible of the climate, of the society and so on. We should start from these people's struggles and wishes when we build our policies. What's going on right now in the Balkans? We have the Serbian president in Western Balkans. I'm confined to these 6 Western Balkan countries which are still not part of the EU. The strongest of these 6 Western Balkan countries by far is Serbia. And we have the Serbian president, which was a minister of the government of Slobodan Milosevic in '99, the genocidal Slobodan Milosevic, which was the perpetrator of crimes in Bosnia, in Croatia, and elsewhere, but also here in Kosovo, terrible crimes. And Vučić was his minister of information, of media, if I can put it so, of communication. He was a minister in the government. Now we have Vučić, which basically managed to erase, to swipe off all of his opposition, and now he controls with more than 80% the parliament of Serbia with his allies. And we have this initiative because Vučić does not accept any possibility for Serbia to join the NATO, so he's not even thinking about transatlantic or North Atlantic security and integration. But he wants Serbia to be a partner of Russia and of the Eurasian project of Putin. And Vučić works in the Balkans closely with Edi Rama, which is another authoritarian politician of Albania, Prime Minister of Albania, which managed to govern without any opposition in the local government, but also in the central government for more than 3 years. And time after time he organizes elections which are full of problems, but he manages to keep the power also because of the opposition parties in Albania suffer from chronic corruption. So now we have Vučić and the Rama working together to threaten the EU to accept Serbia and Albania because of course they don't want to work to raise the standards of the judiciary or of the economy, of the welfare of their people, but they want to gain EU integration by threats. So they work together to threaten the EU, but they also threaten other countries like Kosovo or Bosnia or Montenegro, which are right to be afraid of this initiative. We have a lot of so-called new media. They use a lot of social networking platforms, and they build the so-called portals in the internet, which feed the population with fake news, with I don't know, scandalous titles and so on. And their aim, their effect, actually, is to numb the people's sensitivities, because it's the only way for them to get a pass through all that corruption that is around them. So, in order for them not to have any reaction from the society, they build this numbness. They use it to build a numbness, this kind of communication with a lot of fake news, a lot of scandal, a lot of stories which would sound incredible, trashy, and cheesy in the same way and the same moment. So, but they do this a lot. There are like tons of titles and stories per day coming out of this kind of media, and I think that the progressivist politics would also start a discussion about how media and the new media and the new platforms should be regulated, because it's a little bit like a Far West, and the biggest victim in this case is the unprotected and unorganized private member of the public, the citizen. So we should start discussing about this. Of course, I am anti-censorship and I am for democracy in communication. But here, we are not talking about freedom of speech for the individual. We are talking about freedom of speech for those who can allow luxurious expenditure in buying these ads and using these mechanisms to build any kind of...
That's a really good point, and I think a lot of it is the fact that we are giving a company or a few companies the kind of right to say what is true and what isn't true. We need regulation even to sort of begin to take this control back, let alone make sure those platforms aren't used for nefarious purposes. And I also agree that one of the most effective things is just throwing so much information someplace. It's someone calls it the narcotic function of information. Like when you just get so much information and you shut down. They do this in Texas. You have 1 million elections. But thank you so much for taking us through so much of this, Arber and Orgesa. We appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can catch up soon.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Okay, so Forrest, you were gone, and one of the things that happened when you were gone is that I got curtains, and they're 2 different colors. So I'm going to need you to just stay right there. How would you describe this color blue?
I would say navy.
No, colors have different names based on what they look like, and navy is a different color. Navy is a color that looks like this.
Okay, navy's darker then.
Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and now we are continuing our important work with Hawely Brett, our continental, papal, and royal correspondent, and we will continue our journey with keeping up with the Hapsburgs. I am embarrassed to say that I fell asleep last night during our a few nights ago during our previous engagement on this, so I am going to actually make coffee. I hope you're not disturbed while we're doing this, and I'm also testing out the new experimental kitchen studio apparatus for our upcoming cooking sequences. But Hawely, thank you so much for coming back. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Before we even launch into it, because I know we're trying to catch up to the present so we can learn more about race car driver Hapsburg and his chances maybe at Austrian politicianship. Where I remember it was the family took its name from a castle in Swabia, and then through kind of luck of the draw and not being kind of offensive to anyone, managed to get elected in the Holy Roman Empire, and then conquered a little bit. I wasn't exactly sure, in between Rudolf I and Otto II, they kind of conquered out east towards Austria a bit to kind of make the ancestral lands that we consider the ancestral lands. And I think that's where we left off. Is that about right? Can you start us off someplace? That's as much as I can remember.
Yeah, that's about right. We're starting with the collapse, of course, of the Hohenstaufen line and the election of Rudolf I as the king of the Romans. And we were just getting into how he started to come to power and really consolidate his power. So I can continue, yeah. And I
please,
know that,
take it right from there.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it brief because I know that, of course, our viewers are really anxious to catch up to the present.
Yeah.
So when Rudolf was elected, this did come as a surprise to him because he really was the least bad option, and he wasn't particularly powerful at the time, especially compared to the king of Bohemia at the time, Ottokar II. And King Ottokar had much more power, much more land, a stronger army, but he seemed to want the job way too much. And other prince-electors didn't want to see him come to power. So that's right, they landed on Rudolf I. So his rise to power there was really luck of the draw. The other prince-electors, they also really wanted Rudolf I to establish authority over the king of Bohemia and to take action against him. So coming into this, the pressure was on for Rudolf I to really establish himself and his authority. So the first thing that he did was initially to take a diplomatic approach. Rudolf demanded that King Ottokar return lands that were annexed to him during the Great Interregnum. Ottokar, of course, wasn't having any of this. He totally rejected this stipulation because acquiescing to this request really would have been seen as submission to the authority of Rudolf I. Since this didn't work, Rudolf upped the ante once again. He started making allies with Ottokar's enemies. So he ended up having allies including the Bavarian Witzelbachs, the King of Hungary, and the Count Meinhard of Gorzia Tyrol. He also released the vassals of King Ottokar, so the vassals could quit their jobs or openly revolt, and they wouldn't be held to account for that. They were totally free to do that. So Rudolf I initially just started kind of fucking with the shit of Ottokar II and making friends with his enemies. This, of course, didn't totally get Ottokar to back down, and so in 1276, Rudolf escalated to military action against King Ottokar. He invaded Austria, while his allies simultaneously went into Styria, which is also where Ottokar had land. Simultaneously, King Ottokar was facing a revolt of his own nobility, and so he was really at this weakened point facing all three fronts when Rudolf I was able to defeat him militarily. Still, though, Ottokar, after this defeat, even though it was a big win for Rudolf I, he did not concede. He had allies among the other princes also who didn't want to see the Hapsburgs come to power because, remember, it was a split vote, really, when Rudolf was elected. Many in the Austrian elite were not thrilled either to see Rudolf taking over Vienna, and some of Rudolf's own supporters even abandoned him. So in 1278, there was another military conflict where Rudolf and his remaining allies confronted King Ottokar in Marchfield, which is a broad plain east of Vienna between the villages of Domkrop and Jägenspieken. Ottokar was murdered on the field by personal enemies, and so even though Rudolf I really only squeaked out a slight military victory in this battle, it was a clear win because of Ottokar's death. So that is how the Habsburgs initially made their move from Swabia in Switzerland and really just being only part of the Swabian aristocracy to coming to Vienna. And that's where we think traditionally of, the home of the Habsburgs. Of course, we also call it the House of Austria. And that's really where they began to build their dynasty. After this victory, Rudolf installed some of his sons as rulers of Austria and Styria. By a process called an effment, where feudal lands are deeded to others in service of those others, 2 more territories were added to his empire, but those he gave to 2 of his closest allies. Those lands did not get reverted back into to the Habsburgs until 1335, when those lines went extinct. And so, at this time, Rudolf I, while he was nascent into his rise to power, he wasn't totally powerful. He was still very new, still very limited, despite these initial victories. So he really wanted to concentrate on consolidating his power base. So one of the things that he did was to try to reconcile with Bohemia, and he had his daughter marry Ottokar's son, and then one of Ottokar's daughters married one of Rudolf's sons. And so he tried as much as possible to make peace and alliances with other nobility at the time, and he also tried to follow Hohenstaufen traditions in order to provide some continuity between his leadership and past leadership. However, in a really, important break from Hohenstaufen tradition, he did seek the approval of the Pope. He really wanted to be crowned emperor by the Pope, and he sought this coronation for years and years, but he was never able actually to get it. So, looks like Aaron might have fallen asleep again. I know that we're anxious to get through all of this history, but I think that maybe we should come back to this another time, and we'll get you all caught up.
Oh, you know what I should have done? Knowing full well that you would still be here, I should have come through the curtain like Jacopo and I were talking about at the beginning of the show. That would have been cool. Look, we're still working it out, We have this space. We're trying to make it really work. It may not be until next season, which is going to start roughly at the beginning of September, that we have this kind of new look and feel worked out. But hopefully soon we'll even have guests coming in, etc., 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 etc. But thank you so much for watching the committee program. It was certainly a relief to get to start working on the studio again, being back in Berlin. You've seen a lot of us have been traveling in the summer, both for work and for other reasons, and just getting everything done has been tough. But we don't want to forget about the friends of the show, which are not only you, the audience, but some of these amazing folks who come on a lot. And so for tonight's Sleepy Time reading, I actually wanted to read the introduction of Paolo Garbado's book, The Great Recoil. He's, of course, someone who's been studying populism and has come on the show both to speak about Podemos and about Cinque Stelle. And so we're very grateful, and certainly the issues that he brings up in his book, The Great Recoil, available in Verso Books, I think very soon in August, dovetails very well with a lot of what we talk about on the show. So I want to read the introduction to The Great Recoil by Paolo Garbado. A number of traumatic events, starting with the 2008 economic recession and culminating with the coronavirus crisis, all combined with the impending ecological disaster of climate change and have shaken all political certainties and plunged Western capitalism into political chaos, causing societies to be dominated by anxiety and fear. This is the Great Recoil, a period when the coordinates of history seem to have been reversed. Things that have been taken for granted for a generation, globalization, freedom of movement, economic growth, the clear demarcation of geopolitical friends, rivals, and enemies, all seem to have been thrown into question, creating much disorientation and consternation in politics all around the world. The Great Recoil is the moment when societies turn backward and inward, when globalization goes into retreat. The economy contracts and is barely propped up by massive injections of money by central banks. When people have to withdraw their homes due to lockdowns, quarantines and confinement measures, and must shrink from contact with others. It is the time when society returns to itself, when the shock vis-a-vis the negativity of the world leads to a desperate yearning for interiority and autonomy. And we have to collectively address foundational questions concerning society's basic conditions of existence and self-reproduction. The Great Recoil is a Hegelian metaphor that captures the process of profound ideological transformation at the moment of organic crisis in democratic capitalist societies. Neoliberalism, the economic and political philosophy that shelved the post-war social democratic consensus and remade the world in the name of freedom by boosting private initiative and social inequality over the last 40 years, seems incapable of providing responses to the emerging historical dilemmas. The dogmas of free market economics that have held sway since the 1980s on both the left and the right now look like the rusty remains of a gullible era. Meanwhile, the pandemic has demonstrated the folly of cuts to the public budget in the name of fiscal austerity, which have left health and educational systems in tatters. As the neoliberal worldview started to falter with the post-2008 Great Recession, new movements emerged on the right and the left, often jointly described as manifestations of a populist movement. From the 2011 protest movements, the Brexit referendum, from Trump's election to the rise of the new socialist left and leaders such as Corbyn, Iglesias, and Sanders, recent years have witnessed extreme polarization. Forces at opposite ends of the spectrum have appealed to the people and against the elites and waged war against the central tenets of neoliberal dogma, with the left attacking its socio-economic premises and the right demolishing its cultural tolerance. The populism of the 2010s was the dialectical negation of neoliberalism. After the COVID-19 pandemic, it is time to look beyond the populist movement and assess the new landscape of post-neoliberal politics. Contemporary politics is not just a negative moment, a phase in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born, to cite a famous Gramsci quote obsessively repeated in recent years. Out of the brutal fight between neoliberalism and populism and the shock and panic provoked by coronavirus, something new is emerging. A neo-statism that calls for stronger state intervention in the economy in order to protect society. In an embryonic form, statism was already present in the populist discourse of the 2010s, on the nationalist right, in the defense of hard borders, and on the radical left in the call for a 21st century socialism and the rehabilitation of Keynesian interventionism. The coronavirus emergency has made big government a necessity, overturning the liberal mistrust of a strong state. From massive social transfers to address mounting unemployment and business failure, to proposals of nationalization of strategic infrastructure and investment programs to decarbonize the economy and address climate crisis as those put forward by President Biden, the interventionist state, that traditional bugbear of neoliberalism, is back. With the pandemic, neo-statism has become the new political normal, a meta-ideology that infects virtually all political actors, but also a new battlefield where radically different visions of our political future are butting heads. This book explores the post-neoliberal ideological horizon emerging in the aftermath of the coronavirus. It charts the rise of government protectivism as the key ideological trend in understanding contemporary reshuffling of political discourse and practice in Europe and the United States. The Great Recoil develops a diagnostic of the present, drawing links between emerging ideological motives and the socioeconomic demands that inform them. The new statism of the 2020s and its relationship with the populism of the 2010s and with a fading neoliberalism are examined from a structural and content-oriented perspective in order to overcome the formalism that has dominated much of recent analysis. The crisis of neoliberal globalization is identified as the key motivation for the present ideological shift because of the immense social anxieties it has created. To examine this political realignment, I draw from a wealth of key insights coming from the history of political philosophy at the crossroads between Republican theory and Marxist theory. The reflections on the state found in Plato and Aristotle, the social contract described in Hobbes and Rousseau, and the socialist view of the state in Marx, Gramsci, and Polontas, and the critique of free market liberalism in Polanyi's economic sociology are mobilized to explore the motive and implication of the current revival of the visible hand of the state at a time when social uncertainty is met with a demand for political order. My focus is on the new discourse of the neo-statist politics and the political practices of the post-neoliberal era. On one hand, the volume examines the new slogans, keywords, declarations, and political imagination of contemporary politics. In so doing, it documents the seismic shifts in political discourse after the worn-out free market dogma have been abandoned. On the other hand, my intention is to reveal how this change in political discourse concretely affects policymaking and electoral competition. I examine how the inward-focused orientation of neo-statist politics of protection and control illuminate the nature of the social blocs which support the left and the right, the role played by different enemies among the elites and the underclass in cementing these blocs, the way in which the state is conceived by nationalist socialist forces, and finally, the different responses given to the resurgent question of nationhood. That's something we do on this show a lot. My hope is to provide some sense of political orientation amid a landscape marked by extreme uncertainty so that we can locate the key challenges and the necessary strategy to address the collapse of the neoliberal order. And I think there's a lot that a lot of us can agree with there. The one thing that I think is really interesting from an academic versus a practical standpoint versus an observational standpoint is there's going to be a moment, just like the end of the Roman Empire, where we say this is sort of the end of neoliberalism, but that's not going to be clear in our discourse, on our televisions, in our lives for a long time after that actual end happens. That rhetoric of the last 40, 45 years is what people know. And it's what people in power know. And even as the ground shifts under their feet, they are still going to be reaching for these phrases because it's simply what they're steeped in. I think you see this a lot with folks like Joe Biden, who, as much as we may admire some of his attempts to remake America, finds himself stuck on law and order issues, whether it's smoking marijuana or actually reforming the prison industrial complex. And it's something that 50 years of running on a similar law and order to the right is very hard to undo rhetorically and politically. So even as we're changing, even as we're moving on, you're going to see the words, the rhetoric, and the effect of that in policy linger on. It's a very long-tail thing, as is the committee program. So join us next week and the week after that. Good night, y'all.